Welcome to The Independent with Scott Atlas by the Independent Institute. Here's part 2 of my interview with Kim Strassel of the Wall Street Journal. Well, I want to switch to the topic of the government in information and news access, and the sort of the Twitter files, and now I think we're seeing some exposure of international news, funding news, national or international, with these U.S. Aid agencies. This is just coming out, how much money has been spent by the government for propping up outlets. For instance, Politico, millions of dollars a year, et cetera. And they're not the only ones. And I sort of wonder, what is your experience, or are you surprised at how much direct government involvement there is in the media, which is supposed to be completely independent?
If you look back through the history of this country, and in fact, most other governments in other countries, one of the oldest games is trying to get a hold up or influence the media by the government. I mean, that is a government game of all time. That's why it's so very important. I say this to people all the time. As far as I know, there is only one industry that gets its own shout out in the Constitution, and that is the press. And that's because the founding fathers understood how vital it was to have an independent press. It's why the First Amendment is the First Amendment. And how worried we should be whenever government is somehow seeking to pressure it or influence it or regulate it in any way. The thing that makes me so sad is that our industry itself has kind of wadded up that incredible privilege and thrown it away to a certain degree, that they have not safeguarded it in the way that we need it to be safeguarded. Because I have a lot of theories on this. I think that it's not just falling trust in the media, but when the media doesn't do its job, all kinds of other bad things happen in civil society. And we're seeing some of those happen right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. The other thing that I found, just as an aside, it wasn't the COVID exposed all kinds of problems. I don't think they were necessarily new. But one of the things that I saw in the White House, I directly saw it myself, was that there was censorship going on by the social media companies, not at the direction necessarily of the government, because it was during the Trump administration, when I was there in the, say, fall 2020, where they were censoring what I was saying as advisor to the president. You'd think that in a free society, the people should hear what the advisor to the president was saying during an emergency. But also they were censoring President Trump himself on Facebook, on Twitter then, and on YouTube. And that was a shock to me, because the one thing that I thought we had was freedom of speech in this country. And I think part of it, I was naive, but you're right. This is the fundamental freedom. The press is responsible for giving the information, and whether you like it or not, you get your information through the media. There is no other source of information. So it's such an important, really stiff-arming government, particularly, but really everybody. We need to have the information there, or we're really lost as a society.
I mean, you just bring up a great point, which is that, you can look at traditional media companies and you can question whether or not they have been vigilant enough in protecting their independence and following their mission. But when you're talking about Facebook and Twitter and all these social media companies that now have become such a force in the way that people get their news, you have to remember they don't even come from this industry. They're tech companies. And
Right.
so to a certain degree, to have expected them to put the same kind of premium on the First Amendment and independence was always asking a bit much. They don't come out of that world. It's not what they do. I think there's been a big learning curve there. I think that there's still a lot of learning to go. This sort of mixing of platforms and injection of these major companies. And also, too, remember, Scott, that when you suddenly have a tech company running all of this news, the government has so much more by way of target and pressure to go after them, right? I mean, the the major newspapers out there aren't necessarily the people that are doing mega billion-dollar mergers,
Right.
that are getting evaluated by the Department of Justice, but, Google is, and so are some of these other players, and so the scope by which, that all these different agencies suddenly have an ability to be breathing down your neck gets massively magnified, and we haven't really sorted through all of those questions and problems either.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a very good point too, which is that these things are still in evolution, even though they're evolving very rapidly. And you're right. I hadn't really understood this until you said it, was that the people in tech, these are tech companies. They're not really journalism companies, media companies. Although I think this is rapidly changing. We're seeing very good journalists, not only just doing podcasts or social media, but we're also seeing writers going into things like Substack and a variety of other outlets. So I think the initial promise of more information with the internet, uh, it is now, I think, finally becoming that and competing really very well with the limited sources of information that we had, as opposed to being used as a tool of censorship, which will always be a battle. But I do think that we're getting some very good positives out of it. And again, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I didn't, I think that the election, everything was sort of surprising to me. But we'll see. It's a work in progress. I want to ask you what you think about a topic that I became sort of interested in during my own experience, which is defamation and the role of the media and this New York Times versus Sullivan famous threshold, which for people who don't know, the threshold there for suing for defamation when you're deemed a public figure, even though you didn't want to be a public figure like myself, is that you have to prove malice. You have to prove the intent, and I think that's a very high threshold. Tell me what you, as the face of journalism, think about New York Times versus Sullivan and the kind of the idea, because now we see President Trump suing major news outlets and actually winning, or at least settling for winning, outside of the court on defamation.
Well, it is someone who is a journalist and a proud journalist and who loves my industry. I love the idea of the press. I do get very worried about watering down that standard too far to a point where and we see this in other countries where that standard isn't so high and the lawsuits fly constantly. And it doesn't necessarily lead to better journalism. If you get to a situation as well where the press is too concerned to write the truth as well for fear of a lawsuit that comes at them, that is tough as well. So there's a balancing act to be had.
Absolutely.
And, I one thing I keep reverting to is that newspapers that have very high standards shouldn't have to worry about that so much, but it really is about having high standards, right?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of and actually those standards, if they're not high, are impactful far beyond the United States. It's not just that the United States dominates, it's that when something is written in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, or the New York Times, it's amplified all over the place. I mean, I didn't realize until I was in some of these articles how how the amplification all over the world, it's reproduced as well as referred to directly or indirectly what is written in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and maybe one or two others, is the world's source of information.
Yeah, I mean, and again, my big point always is that if you have a newspaper whose interest and is to go out there, find the truth, report the truth, give both sides their say, and kind of get to the bottom of things. we shouldn't be having these discussions. And I think that it's kind of worrisome to me. It is worrisome to me to see this headed where it's headed.
Yeah, especially I think I think we're seeing it. A lot of things start in the U.S., but I think we're seeing the start of severe censorship in other countries that are shocking to me, and I'm particularly here talking about the UK, where just writing or posting something on social media is a criminal offense. Just the words you say, I think it's very, very concerning, and I'm hoping, although I'm still not sure what's gonna happen with the whole new sort of Trump administration because, A, it could be a very temporary blip in the history of things, uh, or B, it could evolve to have its own censorship issues. I just don't know. I think we have to wait and see. It's very difficult to sort of predict what's happening, which brings me to the next topic I wanna sort of finish up with artificial intelligence and AI, because I think it's this is where it's concerning. It's not concerning to play a game with it. It's not concerning to, make funny videos or whatever, but it is concerning when it can generate something that looks like the truth, like it's historical a reproduction, like it's historical truth, like you can make a video, you can change the sources, you can do anything, you can make people look like they're saying things, and then it's I mean, what is your thinking on this personally as somebody in the industry? And maybe you could talk about what you think is really going to happen in in the very, very near future with AI. How impactful is this now?
Look, I fall in the category of those that believe that used wisely, artificial intelligence has remarkable, remarkable potential for society and the country. I mean, you think about if you harnessed it the right way, something very near to my heart, and you used it alongside quantum computing and you began to really dig in to tackle diseases and unraveling those and cures for that. I mean, it could just be a game changer in many ways.
Sure,
Same
sure.
time, within every industry, they're going to face their own specific challenges about how you put guardrails around it, how you use it intelligently, and how you box it in from being a force for bad. And those are specific to every different industry. Journalism will have its own very specific challenges to deal with that because, again, as we've been talking about this, the very essence of sort of journalism and the trust between the public and journalists is trust. And if suddenly you don't know who is generating what, that is a potentially huge problem.
Yeah, and I'm very concerned with premature regulation of AI, because I think when the government particularly starts jumping in, they don't really know what they're doing, clearly. They meaning people in government, Congress, for instance. And so I'm very worried about not just picking winners and winning technology and things like that, but what to do to regulate something prematurely. I mean, I wonder if we should just make sure that, like, for instance, a regulation might be labeling. It's required that you have to label that something used artificial intelligence. I'm worried about it in this context as the source of information. In journalism, in the media, in reporting, I'm worried about false information. I'm not talking about wrong information. I'm talking about sort of changing historical record of showing people giving speeches, of showing people giving, or even changing the context of the basis of a reference material and things. I just think I'm very concerned. I'm one of those people that has lost trust to a great extent in the people who control the information.
It's a very legitimate view. I mean, we've seen this already, right? So people have been tooling around with AI tools online, and you ask them, answer this very specific question from history, and we know that it's giving woke answers at times, or not giving you the full history, or casting it in a certain way that seems to reflect a political bias. And that gets to the point is we talk about AI broadly, but to a certain extent, we're still talking about a computer, a model, a process. And the same thing always applies, which you will appreciate as a scientist. There's a certain element of garbage in, garbage out, right?
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
so, the question is not just the question is in the creation of it, parameters, and then its use as well. And one thing I worry too is, you speaking of Washington and regulation, is too broad of regulations that do not take into account, as I was mentioning, very specific challenges that are going to be thrown up in different industries and different uses of AI.
Yeah, I know it's clearly a work in progress and all this. Uh, I just think we've lost as a society trust in the people who make these decisions, and I think rightfully so. They created that loss of trust. So now we're in a bit of a quandary, I think, as we look at something like AI, because it's clearly the output is clearly defined by the input.
Mhm.
Uh, even on a low level, the reporters and the people who write the articles, all you have to do is ask a question, and they can generate the article in seconds. That is actually very well written. I think we've all played around with it and seen this kind of thing. So, we'll see. But I hope I think it sounds very naive, but it all depends on having a sort of a moral and ethical compass, and we need to make sure that we foster that in the next generation. It sounds sort of idealistic to say that or whatever, naive, but it's really true. We need to make sure that good people go into particularly journalism and the media in whatever form it evolves into, because there's a huge ethical responsibility of your field that I don't think any of us appreciated until it became what I would call poisonous. I really underestimated the importance of the media.
Yeah, and like I was alluding to earlier, I think that there's a lot of knock-on effects when things go off the rails too. And I'll give you an example. Why right now are we seeing so many congressional investigations into so many things? I fundamentally believe that's because the media isn't doing its job of
Mhm.
investigating, right? Because one thing that we always relied on the media for is sometimes they would break news that involved criminality, for instance, or write about, like, they'd let us know that somebody had truly done something that was breaking the law. But a lot of times, what media has served the purpose of doing is simply highlighting the bad behavior of some officials, letting it be known that that is, out of bounds, not the way you're supposed to behave. There was a certain shame it had the ability to kind of
Right.
to pour on people, and and as a result, people felt as though they got an airing of these problems and an end to the problems, or a satisfactory conclusion to something that had happened. Now, when instead you see Jim Comey completely abuse the position of his office, by the way, not necessarily in a way that was law breaking, because, by the way, Jim Comey is a lawyer. He was very good at, like, making sure he didn't do anything that broke the law. But he clearly misused his office. He clearly was not a good FBI director. He clearly caused this country a lot of upheaval and distress. There would have been a day when the press called him out and really heaped scorn on that and just showed how inappropriate it was and what a fail the FBI had engaged in. When instead it just took dictation from Jim Comey and all of these officers, no one felt as though there was a resolution. And so instead you get 50 congressional investigations into this, and you get, people calling for Jim Comey to go to jail, and Jim Comey waltzes off and gets a teaching job and a book deal, and nobody feels satisfied by that ending. And so Congress doesn't necessarily exist to be quasi law enforcement or the press, but it's increasingly, it like feels as though it's serving the press's job because the press isn't doing that job itself.
I want to finish with sort of almost a specific question about the Wall Street Journal, but not necessarily. And that is, I was always curious the separation between the news side and the editorial side. And I'm not necessarily asking about the journal itself, but about in general all the main news outlets. there is an editorialization, or at least people like me as a layman, I perceive as an editorialization of the news side of TV and of print media. And I had previously in more than a decade ago, I will say is previous, thought that there was very separate sort of responsibilities and jobs between the news side and the editorial side. What's your view on how that's working these days in the U.S.? And I also want to relate that to what happened when, for instance, New York Times had an editorial section was fired because he published conservative opinion pieces. I mean, I just think, what's going on here with the editorial sections? Why can't they be editorials and the news be news? And that's a simpler world there.
Well, I will tell you this, the Wall Street Journal takes very seriously its divide between our news and our editorial page. We do not engage with each other. We have entirely different structures. It's just there's a wall there in between, and I think that that serves us very, very well. The people who come to read things at my newspaper, if they are opinion, they say opinion on them.
Hmm.
And we're just very clear about who works in which department. Um, I agree that it feels as though you see less of that divide. Most newspapers would still point out that they do have separate and news and editorial positions. I think some of the problem is more that some of those newspapers, we're just seeing more people all engaged in the business of I guess, editorializing, as it were, on all things. Now, I will tell you this, it's interesting because I'm a big believer that, we have as human beings this tendency to say things have never been as bad as they are now. We're living the worst time ever. I would note that this kind of division between editorial and news is more of a modern phenomenon in American press. Kind of a 20th century thing. If you go back to some of the original newspapers, they were bought or owned or stood up by wealthy owners precisely because they wanted the newspaper to be an outlet for their views and their kind of
Hmm.
thoughts on things. And that we lived with that for many years. And that is still, by the way, the model that you see more frequently in a lot of newspapers in Europe, for instance. They have very definite sort of casts in terms of what's on their front page. Um, I I think we may get back. This is part of the whole settling we've been talking about. I think there's a
Right.
lot of upheaval and disruption, but I think that a lot of people will see that it has served newspapers, the industry, the country good to have that kind of news side, editorial side separation. And, I think that I still believe in the ability of self correction.
Right. What about the idea that new editorials sections are reluctant to publish? I don't know how it works. I'm sort of asking this really. Reluctant to publish pieces. I'm not talking about the editorial board pieces and the regular columnists. I'm talking about outside pieces. Reluctant to publish pieces that are differing from the view of the editorial board, for instance. Is that a surprise, or am I wrong and it really doesn't happen that way, that there's any kind of blockage of things published opposing the editorial board?
Well, we don't subscribe to that. I mean, we routinely publish outside contributors.
Yes, I notice I often disagree with those
Yeah,
pieces.
no, because by the way, we are in the business of moving us into and having a debate about the best way forward on policy, and you can't have that unless you are having an intellectual debate and discussion about this in a civil fashion.
Totally
And
agree.
and and that is what we believe we do. I do think it's really unfortunate. I think we hit the kind of the mania of that, the apex of that at the kind of height of cancel culture. And one thing again, just that I love about this country is we tend to see these pendulum swings, but we often, we see them swing back. And, I watched Donald Trump signing that executive order about women's sports. And you just think back to 4 years ago, it was taboo to even say anything about that subject until
Right.
some people were brave enough to come out. And by the way, there were people that, if you made that argument and really pushed that argument, you might have been at risk of losing your job or being canceled in some way. And we've seen that change where people, were suddenly like, well, actually, I don't agree with that. And it turns out it's kind of a 90-10 position in the
Right.
country, right?
It's
Um,
mainstream.
it's mainstream. And so I think we have moments where we lose our way. We forget the importance of speaking up and free speech. But I do think there are reasons to believe that that is changing some.
Well, I think we'll leave it on that note. It's an upbeat note. I want to thank you, Kim, for taking your time on somebody who has a very hectic schedule, and I hope I have you on again soon.
I would love to. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for listening to The Independent with Scott Atlas. If you want to find out more about today's guest, Kim Strassel, watch her expert commentary on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal and on TV's Journal Editorial Report on Fox News, and follow her on Twitter at Kim Strassel. And don't forget, subscribe to this show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and anywhere else you're listening to podcasts right now, and I'll see you next time.